Really appreciate you being with us today, Lynn, and sharing with us your organization, the Nisei Veterans Legacy.
I'm so glad to be here, Lila. First of all, thank you so much for your interest in the Nisei soldier story. Happy to be here.
Well, it would seem logical to include you in the conversation here at Punchbowl, because Punchbowl is not just any cemetery.
It's a very special place. It's run by the VA, but any veteran, of course, can be buried here. My dad is in a niche here with my mom, and so I come here every week. It's a very familiar place for me.
And so help me understand, as someone we grew up not knowing war directly, but you're very familiar with what those veterans of war felt, and that's why the organization exists.
Actually, I have to admit that I'm kind of a late bloomer. And what I mean by that, Lila, is that although, of course, I knew my father, Walter, was a member of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. He was a disabled veteran, was injured on the battlefields in Italy in World War II. He never really talked much about his experience. So consequently, I did not know much at all. And what I've come to learn is that many of these Nisei veterans really didn't talk much about what they did. What I have found is that these men and women who served were very humble. They were very humble about their service. And although with my father, although I know he was so deeply proud of his service, he was never prideful about what he did. So I did not know that much about his service personally, and I actually knew very little about the 100th, about the 442nd. I don't remember being taught much about this in schools, and I think that's something that we would like to see changed.
But something touched you in this story, because I would suspect too, as humble as your father was, and many of the veterans were, they were also deeply hurt and touched and driven by forgiveness, I would think.
Right. I'd like to share a little bit of an embarrassing story with you, if I could. As I mentioned, growing up here, although I knew my dad was in the 442nd, I didn't know much. And it was only when I went to work for the U.S. Army in Washington, and I worked at the Pentagon, and I had my father's Army jacket hanging in my office. On the shoulder of the jacket is the Go for Broke patch. It's a very recognizable torch. And so when soldiers and officers would come into my office, they would literally make a beeline for that jacket because they recognized that Go for Broke torch as representing the 442nd. And it was through their being in awe of what the 442nd did, and that I happened to be a descendant, that I learned a deeper appreciation for what these soldiers and some women did as well. So I decided that when I retired and returned to Hawaii, I would do everything I could to try to preserve and tell that story.
So please tell us a little bit more about the mission and the vision of the organization.
Sure, I'd be glad to do that. First of all, the word Nisei is a Japanese word, and it means the second generation Japanese to be in this country. And so the Issei were the first generation. They gave birth to the Nisei generation. So typically the soldiers who fought during World War II were Nisei soldiers. So the NVL was founded in 2012. We are a small nonprofit 501c3 located here on Oahu. And our educational mission is simply to preserve and share the story of the Nisei soldiers of World War II. And that would include those who served in the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the Military Intelligence Service, and the 1399 Engineer Construction Battalion, not to mention the many Nisei women who served as well.
And what sort of activities are you involved in?
We execute against our mission in a number of ways. We have any number of exhibits that we've put together. Our most recent and largest exhibit is the Hawaii Nikkei Legacy exhibit. It's a 26-panel traveling exhibit that documents the immigration of the Japanese to Hawaii through the present time. The exhibit actually toured all over Japan. We give any number of presentations, Lila. I've given presentations to community groups. We host a number of community events. So, for example, every year we host an annual memorial service right here at Punchbowl. And it's a free service open to the public. And during that 1 hour time, we give honor to the Nisei soldiers of World War II. Sadly, as you can appreciate, each year there are fewer veterans who can attend. However, each year there are more young people who attend. And so recently we've been able to really bring in JROTC cadets, Boy Scouts, and they've really become a fixture in this memorial. So we do a lot of community events as well.
I would imagine it's not just the memory of what they lived through, but also when they came home.
Many of the other organizations here in Hawaii, and for a while ourselves as well, really focused on what I would say is the battlefield experience. What these soldiers did on the battlefields in the European theater as well as in the Pacific. And truly those were extraordinary exploits, extraordinary. But the way I like to think about it is that they actually fought 2 battles. And the second one they fought, Lila, was when they came back to Hawaii. When many of these veterans returned to Hawaii, they said, "We're tired of working on the plantations. We don't want to be second-class citizens anymore." So many of them got an education. They went into business. They went into politics. And they, working with many others, really helped transform Hawaii into a more equitable place.
So a final message that you've learned and you'd like us to also pay attention to?
I think what's important is that I think the legacy of these Nisei soldiers will only live on if that legacy is embraced by the youth in our community. And so one of the things that the NVL is trying very hard to do is to bring the story to the youth here in Hawaii so they can take a look at the lessons of history and make them relevant for their lives today.
Well, thank you very much for that motivation, that inspiration, and for being with us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
We've just had the opportunity to meet Lynn Heirakuji, who is the president of the Nisei Veterans Legacy.